before the cartel, before the billions, before the bombs. There was a barefoot boy in a small Colombian town, angry, hungry, and watching the rich drive past him like he didn't exist. This is not the story of a drug lord. This is the story of how one became. Riangro, Antioquia, 1949. A town so small, everyone knew everyone's name except no one would remember this family. The Escobars were poor. Not the romantic kind of poor you see in movies. Real poor, dirt floor poor. The kind where hunger isn't a feeling, it's a daily visitor. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on December 1st into a world that had already decided what he was worth. And from his very first breath, that world had made a terrible mistake. His mother, Hermilda Gaviria, was a schoolteacher, strong, proud, fiercely devoted. She looked at Pablo and saw greatness. She told him so every single day. His father, Abel de Jesus Escobar, was a peasant farmer, quiet, hard-working, invisible. Abel taught Pablo what it meant to labor endlessly and still have nothing. Pablo watched his father and made a silent, iron promise to himself. He would never live like that. His mother gave him ambition. His father gave him a reason to burn. Teachers remembered him. Not for being the best student, but for the way he looked at things. Intense. Calculated. Like he was always measuring something nobody else could see. Pablo wasn't passionate about books. He was passionate about outcomes. Even as a child, he didn't ask how things worked. He asked who controlled them. Classmates sensed something different about him. A quiet electricity. A restless hunger behind his eyes that didn't belong in a village classroom. This was not a boy who would stay small. When Pablo was a teenager, the family moved to Envigado, on the edge of Medellin, Colombia's second city, a roaring, chaotic, electric place. For a boy from a quiet village, it was overwhelming and intoxicating. Medellin showed Pablo two worlds living side by side, the wealthy in their walled neighborhoods, the poor in hillside slums called comunas. He walked those streets wide-eyed, absorbing everything. The inequality wasn't just visible, it was loud. It insulted you. And Pablo Escobar was a boy who did not take insults quietly. It started small. It always does. Pablo and his cousin Gustavo Gaviria began stealing tombstones from local cemeteries, sanding them down and reselling them to grieving families. It sounds almost comical now, but look closer, this was not random mischief. This was enterprise. He saw an opportunity, assessed the risk, moved fast, and profited. The police never caught them. And that taught Pablo something dangerous. That crime was not only possible, it was easy. The first hit of adrenaline from outsmarting the system was a drug all its own. By his mid-teens, Pablo had graduated from tombstones to a small but growing criminal curriculum. Counterfeit lottery tickets, smuggled cigarettes, stolen cars resold through back channels. He ran cons with a smile, moved product with precision, and kept his circle tight. What made him different from ordinary street criminals wasn't just the audacity, it was the organization. Every small operation was run like a business. He tracked costs, managed people, and reinvested profits. Most teenagers were chasing girls. Pablo was quietly building a system. People who knew Pablo then described something unnerving: his ability to read people instantly. He could sense what a man wanted, what he feared, what price he had. He used this like a tool. In negotiations, even teenage ones, he rarely raised his voice. He just waited, watched, then offered exactly what the other person needed to hear. Teachers called him clever but unfocused. His criminal associates called him sharp as a blade. The truth was both. Pablo's mind was always running an algorithm the rest of the room couldn't see. Every legend has a teacher. Pablo's came in the form of small-time Medellin smugglers who recognized his potential and pulled him deeper into their world. These men moved contraband cigarettes, electronics, appliances across Colombian borders with quiet efficiency. Pablo watched, listened, and learned fast. He absorbed the logic of the underground economy. Trust no one fully, pay people more than they expect, and always have an exit. These were not Pablo's ideals. They were his inheritance. And he would one day build a cathedral on top of them. By his late teens, Pablo had established his first real criminal operation. A car theft ring operating across Medellin. It wasn't small. He had scouts who identified targets, drivers who moved vehicles, mechanics who altered them, and buyers already lined up before the cars were even stolen. This was organized crime, not street hustle. When conflicts arose, Pablo handled them personally and decisively. Word spread this young man from Envigado didn't flinch. He didn't negotiate from weakness. For the first time, people in Medellin's underworld said his name with caution. Underneath all the strategy and calculation was something raw and unhealed. Pablo Escobar hated poverty with a visceral personal fury. He had been embarrassed by it, dismissed because of it. He once described watching a wealthy man step over a beggar without blinking and feeling something break and rebuild inside him simultaneously. Poverty, to Pablo, wasn't just an economic condition. It was a humiliation, a verdict. And he had decided with the cold certainty of someone who has never doubted themselves that the verdict was wrong. In 1974, Pablo met Maria Victoria Henao. She was 15. He was 24. Their relationship horrified her family. Her brother threatened Pablo's life. Pablo showed up anyway. He was charming, attentive, and completely certain she would be his. Maria Victoria later described him as the most magnetic person she had ever met. She saw tenderness in him that the world would never see. They married in 1976. In her eyes, we catch the only glimpse of a Pablo untouched by empire, a man still capable of something close to love. The late 1970s brought a new opportunity, one that would change not just Pablo's life, but the entire Western Hemisphere. Cocaine. At the time, the cocaine trade was fragmented, risky, and mostly run by small, independent operators. Pablo saw what others missed. This was not a drug problem. It was a logistics problem. If you could control the supply chain, production, transport, distribution, you could control everything. He began his first cocaine runs modestly, moving product north from Colombia. What he was really doing was sketching the blueprint of an empire. Before Pablo dominated the trade, there were others who had carved small paths before him. He studied them carefully, their methods, their mistakes, their blind spots. He approached experienced smugglers not as rivals but as professors. He asked questions. He listened. He copied what worked and ruthlessly discarded what didn't. Then, one by one, he surpassed every single teacher. Some he absorbed into his network. Some he simply removed. Pablo never forgot a lesson. And he never let a mentor become a ceiling. That was what made him genuinely dangerous. Here is what separated Pablo Escobar from every other criminal in Colombia at the time. He thought globally when everyone else thought locally. While others were satisfied moving kilos, Pablo was imagining tons. While others bribed a single officer, Pablo was planning to own entire institutions. He saw cocaine not as a street product but as an international commodity like oil, like coffee with unlimited demand in the wealthiest nation on earth. The United States wasn't just a market. To Pablo, it was a treasure chest, and he had found the key. Every empire needs architecture. Pablo began assembling his with ruthless precision. He recruited based on three qualities: loyalty, capability, and hunger. He paid better than anyone. He protected his people until they gave him reason not to. He created cells of operations so compartmentalized that if one broke, the others remained invisible. He built relationships with farmers, chemists, pilots, corrupt officials, and street soldiers simultaneously. This was not a gang. This was a corporation. And Pablo was its founder, its board, and its enforcement arm all at once. Silver or lead. Accept my bribe or accept my bullet. This was not just a catchphrase, it was a governing philosophy. Pablo understood that in Colombia's compromised institutions, most men had a price. He found it and paid it. For those who refused, the message was equally clear and final. What made this approach so devastatingly effective was its consistency. Pablo never bluffed. When he said plomo, he meant it. That reliability, that horrible dependability is what turned a policy into a legend, and a legend into absolute power. Few people know that Pablo Escobar genuinely wanted political legitimacy. In 1982, he was elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Chamber of Representatives. He wore a suit. He gave speeches. He talked about poverty and opportunity with the conviction of someone who had lived both. He wasn't performing entirely. Pablo believed he deserved a seat at the table, not just a place in the shadows. Politics was his attempt to make the world recognize what he already knew about himself. That he was not a criminal, he was a force. While building his criminal empire, Pablo also built something else: neighborhoods. He funded the construction of hundreds of homes for Medellin's poorest residents, a project called Medellin Sin Tugurios Medellin without slums. He built football fields, schools, and churches. He handed out cash at community events. He showed up in the comunas where no politician ever came. Was it genuine? Was it strategy? The answer is both, and that complexity is exactly what made him so powerful. The poor loved him. And love, Pablo understood, was its own kind of currency. Pablo was a master of narrative long before the world understood what that meant. He cultivated priests, journalists, and community leaders not through ideology but through access and money. Local newspapers that praised him received envelopes. Those that challenged him received warnings. He understood that controlling the story was as important as controlling the streets. The church offered him moral cover. The press offered him mythology. And Pablo used both expertly, constructing a public image so carefully managed that millions of people could simultaneously fear and adore the same man. Pablo was present at his children's birthdays. He read to them at night. He wept, reportedly, when his daughter was sick. Those who knew him privately describe a man who could be warm, funny, even gentle. And yet, by this same period, Pablo had ordered killings. He had watched men die and eaten dinner afterward. These were not separate Pablo Escobars. They were the same one, which is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. Monsters are easier to understand when they don't also tuck their children into bed. The name of the first man Pablo ordered killed is debated by historians. What is not debated is that it happened early before the cartel, before the billions, a local enforcer, a rival who had become inconvenient, a signal sent to Medellin's underworld that Pablo Escobar was no longer a boy playing at crime. He was operating with terminal seriousness. Those who were there say Pablo showed no visible emotion afterward. That absence, that void where remorse should have lived, was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. There is a psychological threshold that men like Pablo cross, and once crossed, nothing looks the same. When you have enough money that it stops meaning anything, when fear of you precedes you into every room, when the president of a country knows your name, Pablo crossed that threshold in the early 1980s, and what followed was not satisfaction. It was acceleration. Power, once tasted at scale, demands more of itself. The man who had vowed never to be poor had become something far more dangerous, a man who could no longer imagine limits. By the early 1980s, Medellin was Pablo's city in every sense that mattered. Police looked away. Judges recused themselves. Politicians returned his calls. The comunas celebrated him like a folk hero. Even those who hated him, and there were many, understood that hatred had a price tag. The ordinary rhythms of the city moved around Pablo the way water moves around a stone. He hadn't conquered Medellin with an army. He had conquered it with money, fear, and an intimate understanding of exactly what each person in the city needed. Colombia's institutions in the late 1970s and early 1980s were not strong. They were underfunded, underpaid, and structurally vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure Pablo applied. Judges who ruled against him were killed. Officers who couldn't be bought were transferred or buried. Politicians who accepted his donations became unwitting accomplices. The state didn't fall to Pablo in a single dramatic moment. It eroded quietly, bureaucratically, shamefully, one compromised official at a time. And each compromise made the next one easier. That is how empires are not just built. That is how nations are unmade. Pablo Escobar was obsessed with how history would remember him. He gave interviews carefully. He positioned himself against the backdrop of Colombian inequality deliberately. He wanted to be seen not as a criminal, but as a rebel, a man who had broken unjust rules in an unjust world. He admired Simón Bolívar with an intensity that was almost religious. He saw himself in that tradition. The liberator, the outsider, the man bold enough to rewrite the rules. The fact that this self-image required rivers of blood did not seem to trouble him. Violence, for Pablo, was never random. It was communication. Every assassination, every bombing, every threat delivered in the night was a precisely worded message to a specific audience. He understood that in a world where law was weak, terror was the most efficient enforcer of contracts. When Pablo killed a judge, he wasn't just removing one obstacle, he was sending a memo to every judge in Colombia. When he bombed a building, he wasn't just causing destruction, he was reminding a government that nowhere was safe. Fear, deployed strategically, was cheaper than any army. The Medellin cartel was formally consolidated in the early 1980s. Pablo at its center, flanked by the Ochoa brothers Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio and the volatile, brilliant Carlos later. Together, they transformed cocaine trafficking from a patchwork of independent operators into a vertically integrated multinational. Later provided the air routes. The Ochoas provided network and legitimacy. Pablo provided vision, violence, and the organizational architecture that held it all together. This was not a gang. This was the most profitable criminal enterprise in the history of the world, and Pablo ran it. The United States in the 1980s was cocaine's largest and most lucrative market. Miami was the entry point, glamorous, corrupt, and wide open. Pablo's product flooded American cities with a purity and volume that the market had never seen. The DEA began hearing a name. CIA analysts flagged it. Journalists in Miami started connecting dots. Washington hadn't been paying attention to Colombia. Now, suddenly, it had to. Pablo didn't go looking for a war with America. But he understood that America coming for him was inevitable, and he had already started preparing. At the height of his power, Pablo Escobar was generating an estimated $420 million per week. His net worth peaked somewhere around $30 billion. His accountants estimated that 10% of all cash was simply lost to rats and moisture, and it didn't matter. He buried money in fields. He hid it in walls. He owned properties he had never visited. Former associates say the wealth became almost abstract numbers too large to mean anything. Yet Pablo still remembered every single peso he had ever been denied. That memory never left him. In 1984, Colombian Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla publicly exposed Pablo's criminal ties and had him removed from his congressional seat. Pablo responded by ordering Lara's assassination. The minister was gunned down in Bogotá in April 1984. This was the moment. Not because it was Pablo's first killing, it wasn't, but because it was the first time he had declared open war on the Colombian state itself. The government couldn't look away. Extradition treaties with the United States became real threats. Pablo had not just crossed a line, he had erased it. Colombia's response to Lara's murder was immediate and for the first time serious. President Belisario Batancur activated extradition treaties with the United States. Pablo, who feared an American prison above almost anything, declared all-out war on the concept of extradition. He called himself a Colombian patriot. He framed extradition as a national humiliation. He lobbied, he bribed, he threatened. He had candidates killed. He bombed infrastructure. The Colombian government quickly discovered that fighting Pablo Escobar was not like fighting crime. It was like fighting a well-funded, highly motivated, thoroughly armed enemy nation. What followed was one of the most extraordinary conflicts in modern history. A single man waging war against an entire nation. Pablo bombed banks, shopping centers, and government buildings. He had presidential candidates assassinated. He blew a commercial aircraft out of the sky, killing 107 people in an attempt to murder one man he believed was on board. Entire neighborhoods lived under the shadow of his terror. The Colombian state, already fragile, buckled repeatedly. And through all of it, Pablo continued to move product, pay soldiers, and collect billions. The war, to him, was simply overhead. By the late 1980s, something fascinating had happened. Pablo Escobar had become larger than reality. He was talked about in whispers, in myths, in contradictions. The poor called him a saint. The rich called him a monster. The press called him everything at once. International media descended on Colombia, turning Pablo into a global story, a cinematic villain so perfectly cast that fiction couldn't compete. And Pablo, always the strategist, understood that the myth itself was now a weapon. Fear of Pablo Escobar had outlasted every plan Colombia made to stop him. Colonel Hugo Martinez, who led the search block tasked with hunting Pablo, described him as the most dangerous man he had ever encountered, not because of the guns, but because of the mind. Former rival cartel members said Pablo had a gift for patience that was almost inhuman. He could wait years to settle a score. American DEA agents who worked the case described a man simultaneously brilliant and delusional. Everyone who faced Pablo professionally said the same thing in different words. Underestimating him was the last mistake many people ever made. Walk through certain neighborhoods in Medellin today, and you will still find Pablo's face on murals. People who grew up in the comunas describe receiving food, money, and football fields from a man the government said was a monster. To them, he was the only powerful person who had ever looked at them. This is not justification. It is testimony. Pablo Escobar understood something that governments across Latin America repeatedly failed to grasp. That poverty is not just an economic wound, it is a hunger for dignity. And he fed it deliberately and strategically. Pablo's son, Sebastián Mariquin, born Juan Pablo Escobar, has spent decades speaking publicly about his father. He describes a man of profound contradictions. A father who played soccer with him in hiding, who cried reading letters from his children, who called family the only thing that mattered. And the same man who, Sebastián later understood, had ordered the deaths of hundreds. Maria Victoria, Pablo's wife, stayed until the end. She said she loved the man, not the myth. That distinction, loving what is human inside a monster, is perhaps the saddest story of all. By the early 1990s, Pablo's empire was showing fractures. The Los Pepes vigilante group, composed of his enemies, rivals, and former allies, was hunting his network with terrifying efficiency. His most trusted lieutenants were dying or defecting. The Colombian National Police, now funded and equipped with American intelligence, was closing in methodically. Pablo moved constantly safe house to safe house, city to city, never sleeping in the same place twice. The man who had owned an entire country was now a fugitive in it. The architecture of his power was crumbling room by room. In those final months, those who spoke to Pablo described a different man, still defiant, still issuing orders, but also reflective in ways he had never been before. He talked about Riangro, about his mother, about the early days before the blood and the billions. In radio transmissions to his family, which the Colombian police were tracking in real time, he sounded, for the first time, like someone who understood the weight of what he had built. Not regret, exactly, but recognition. The barefoot boy from Antioquia was running out of road. December 2nd, 1993. Medellin. Pablo made a radio call to his family, his voice calm, almost warm. It lasted too long. The search block triangulated the signal within minutes. Within the hour, they had surrounded a modest two-story house in the Los Olivos neighborhood. What followed was a brief, violent firefight. When it was over, Pablo Escobar lay dead on a rooftop, shot behind the ear. He was 44 years old. Colombian security forces photographed themselves around his body with the particular triumph of men who had spent years believing this day might never come. So who was Pablo Escobar before the cartel? He was a boy who felt the world's contempt and decided to make the world pay for it. He was a son who loved his mother and broke every value she tried to teach him. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence who chose the darkest possible application for it. He was, above all, a human being, which is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Because monsters are easier. Monsters don't come from hunger. Monsters don't come from barefoot childhoods and burning ambition. People do, and that should terrify us all.
If you want more hidden Escobar secrets, smash that like button right now. Subscribe and share this video with your crew.